Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we're going to be jumping back into GameMaker to continue our work with improving our enemies. Right now I modified one of my variables for one of the enemies, and so here at the top you see this enemy. Whenever it jumps down and it lands, it just kind of runs off the edge. I want to add a little bit more intelligence to my enemy so that way it doesn't just run off the edge, and I want my enemy not to become active until it can see me. In order for us to get that done, let's go ahead and jump back into the code. One correction that I do have to make, over in O melee, I did leave this reference to O enemy, which means that now our O targetables no longer can be hit with the melee weapon. Just make sure you update this to be O targetable, and that way it'll be able to swing and hit both the targetable block as well as enemies and any other children we end up creating based off of O targetable. And so match this with whatever you named the original block. I have created for us a new sprite, enemy astronaut idle, and this just represents my astronaut just turning around looking for the enemy. We'll be focusing on our O enemy for the moment. First, in order for us to be able to check if the enemy is going to fall off, the easiest way is to do some checks over here in our step event. And over in the variable definitions, let's go ahead and add in a variable so we can check to see if the enemy is going to fall off. I'm going to call this afraid of heights. I'm going to make this a boolean. So by default, I'm going to assume that my enemies are not afraid of heights, so I don't check this. This means by default the enemy is going to fall off the edge. And now let's go ahead and add in the code that will use our afraid of heights variable. And we're going to check if we're afraid of heights first, and we're on the floor, and we will not be touching a wall in our next move, x plus, in this case I'm going to use my sprite width divided by 2, and y plus 1 pixel down. If moving over that appropriate amount in the x and y directions, there's no wall object there, then that means we're going to fall. So now we can do something about that. If I'm afraid of heights, meaning that we don't want this enemy to fall, I'm currently on the floor, and the next step I move is going to not touch a wall. If that's the case, then we simply need to change horizontal speed to be times equals -1. With this, if I'm moving towards the right, a positive x, times -1 will flip us to moving to the negative direction, -x. If I'm moving -x, times equals -1, we'll update that to now be positive, and we'll be moving towards the right once again. So this will keep our enemy going back and forth. Let's go ahead and go into the room. I made this platform earlier, as y'all saw, and now we have a new variable, afraid of heights. I'm going to turn this on for this enemy. I'm also going to move him a little over. Let's go ahead and run that. He lands, and he saw the edge and didn't fall off. He saw that edge and didn't fall off. Now the enemy walks back and forth on that upper platform, and we don't have to be concerned with him jumping off. Now, of course, if I go back into here and I remove this, the enemy will have a false value for that, so it'll never care about the heights, and it'll simply jump off and move on to the next platform. So this is a nifty way for you to swap it out as needed amongst all your enemies whenever you place them into the world. Now that we have that set up, I also want to set something up so that way the enemy doesn't become active until the enemy sees me. This enemy should not see us at all. So jumping back into our workspace, we're going to add another variable. Now I'm going to call this variable Sentry. And this is going to be another Boolean value. This will be true. If Sentry is true, then that means they will be looking for the player. So actually, since I don't want to change the current operations, I'm going to leave this false by default. And then if I want the enemy to stand there and wait until they see the player to begin movement, then we can go into our instances in the room and set Sentry to be true. Let's go ahead and do that. Jumping into the enemy's layer, this variable, I'm going to set Sentry to be true. Let's go back into our enemy and we're going to create a check over here and have a variable created, seen player. This by default is false. So, have they seen the player? This is only useful for the sentries. All of the other enemies don't care, they're always moving back and forth. Maybe you can add in some code to do something different with this, but for my purposes, those enemies will not end up using this variable. However, over here, if Sentry is true and seen player is false, so we have not seen the player, then I want my enemy to simply stand in place, flipping back and forth between my different frames of my enemy idle animation. It'll simply stand here and look around. If we're a sentry and we haven't seen the player, then we're not going to be doing anything. We're not going to be doing any of these checks. This only happens if we have seen the player. So else, so how do we know when to exit this state, to exit this doing nothing? That's where we're going to bring into play two different checks. One is point distance. So if point distance between our O player's X value, our O player's Y value, and our current X and Y values, if this is less than, let's say, 300 pixels, 600 pixels, we'll leave it at 600. So if we're within 600 pixels of the enemy, that way we don't have an enemy from across the entire map begin moving just because we got within sight. If we're close enough to the enemy, within 600 pixels, and there's no collision with, let me move this around, and there is no collision between our X and Y position of the enemy, O player's X and Y position with any wall object. Because if you draw a line between these two and there is a wall in the way, then that means the enemy cannot see us. There's two more arguments to pass in. False on whether or not you're going to do precise collisions, and then false whether you're going to count the enemy within the actual check. We don't need to. So after we've written that entire lengthy statement, are we within 600 pixels? And do we see the enemy? Seen player is now true. If that's the case, then whenever it runs through this check, it's going to see are we a sentry or not, or is it constantly looking for something. And then if we have seen the player, we have seen the player, so it'll be not true. That sets it to false. It'll exit us out of this. Now, I forgot a comma right here, and that should address all of those errors. And now we have a way to have our enemy look for the player and then swap over. Now we of course have to add in the segment of code dealing with the sprite. Now by default, we use the default sprite of the enemy where they're just walking. We of course don't want them to be walking, we want them to instead be using our astronaut idle. So back in our code, if Sentry. Then I need to go ahead and make sure that our Sprite index is equal to S_enemy astronaut idle. And this will make sure we have the correct idle sprite. It'll scale it down for our purposes. Then in the step event, whenever we swap over, we need to do Sprite index is equal to, and we modify it to now be S_enemy astronaut. And whenever you swap sprites, remember you do need to still scale it correctly. Otherwise, it might accidentally be too big or too small based on what you're working with. You do this every time you swap sprites. All we need to do is place on floor calculations to be done before our checks, and then add in if Sentry and on floor and not seen by the player. Then we switch to the Sentry mode. If instead we are not on the floor, it will fail this check and allow us to normally move. So if I were to run this, we'll see that the enemy is in Sentry mode. If I restart it, you can see the enemy did actually fall to the right before entering Sentry mode. Otherwise, that wraps us up for this lesson. If you have any questions or need any assistance, make sure you let me know in class. Everyone, have a good one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.